It's time for another aside. This one is our first JavaScript aside. That means we're going to talk about some JavaScript concept, some part of the language itself that will move on to helping us understand Node.js. This JavaScript aside is JavaScript engines and the ECMAScript specification. Oh, and just to avoid any confusion, big word alert, ECMAScript. ECMAScript is the standard that JavaScript is based on. JavaScript was invented first, but then different browser makers like Microsoft and Netscape, they started making their own JavaScript engines and their own little tweaks and changes and differences between them. And the ECMA is an organization that basically is a standards organization. It says, hey, let's try and say exactly how something should work. And so ECMAScript is the name for the core standard that JavaScript itself bases itself on. And we needed that standard because there are many engines out there. V8, which Node.js is built on top of, is actually just one of many JavaScript engines. So when we're talking about JavaScript and we're talking about ECMAScript, you can basically think of them as the same thing. But JavaScript is the actual language that we're writing, and ECMAScript is the standard that says how the language should work. It's a core scripting language standard. All right, but for the purposes of our discussion, they're essentially interchangeable terms. Now, if you want to take a look at the ECMAScript standard, the specification, all you need to do is do a Google search. Go and do ECMAScript 2015 specification. And that Google search will get you a link to ecma-international.org, and you'll see the 6th edition. That's the very latest that's adding new features to the language. But it's good enough for our purposes at this moment, just because we're trying to make a point. If you look at the specification and were to go down through it, you'd see all sorts of things that JavaScript is supposed to have and supposed to do. It describes its behavior. It describes exactly what should be expected when certain things are done in the language, and therefore is the standard upon which JavaScript engines should be based. In other words, if you were to write your own JavaScript engine, what you cause JavaScript code to do should match the specification. V8 does that. V8 makes sure that the JavaScript code that is written, the machine code that it's translated to, does what the specification expects it to do. And the specification is just a standard that everyone has agreed upon. This is the way JavaScript should work. So, again, a JavaScript engine, what is it? Well, let's do it in this form. Big word alert. A JavaScript engine. A program that converts JavaScript code into something the computer processor can understand. And really it should follow the ECMAScript standard, which tells us how the language should work and what features the language should have. V8 is a JavaScript engine, and it sits at the core of Node.js. All right, let's take a look at V8 just a little bit deeper.